The spectacle of right-wing grievance politics collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. When migrants drown at sea or refugees are caged, cruelty is rebranded as comedy and monetized through merchandise, memes, and talking point theatrics. Yet, when violence returns home, when one of their tribunes is struck, the discourse shifts overnight from sadism to sanctimony. Suddenly, empathy and the sanctity of life are invoked, not as universal values, but as tribal shields. It reveals a morality less concerned with human suffering than with preserving the imagined innocence of their own political cohort. Equally revealing is the grotesque idolatry of the Second Amendment. Its defenders treat firearms not as tools, but as civic sacraments, brushing aside the predictable carnage as the cost of freedom. The irony is staggering. A movement that insists mass death is acceptable collateral in the name of liberty also demands national mourning when its own suffers. This is not empathy, but selective outrage, rooted in the same supremacist logic that has always rationed compassion along racial, national, and ideological lines. The dissonance is not incidental, it is the defining feature of the politics itself. Heather Lyle's passage is a perfect case study in what social theorists have described as the pathology of the oversocialized individual. It's a text steeped in selective outrage, self-deception, and projection. Beneath its layers of rhetoric lies a mind so conditioned by modern ideology that it cannot perceive its own contradictions. Heather does not merely argue poorly, she reveals sentence by sentence the psychology of a class that is simultaneously hyper-moralistic and deeply nihilistic. Social theorists identified the oversocialized individual as someone trapped in a perpetual loop of self-repression and guilt, endlessly measuring themselves against an impossible moral standard imposed by society. Heather's opening paragraphs are precisely this dynamic externalized. She fixates on cruelty, migrants drowning, refugees caged, not to alleviate suffering, but to display her own virtue. Her outrage is performative, an act of penance for her own internalized sense of inadequacy. Cruelty is rebranded as comedy and monetized through memes, she writes, as if memes, not human traffickers or geopolitical realities, are the true evil. But this fixation on symbols is telling. Over-socialized individuals can't deal with concrete realities. They must frame everything through abstract moral theatre, where public displays of guilt and outrage substitute for genuine action. In these terms, this is not compassion, it's neurotic ritual, a compulsive performance to stave off inner collapse. Heather's entire worldview is built upon what these theorists call the inferiority complex. The over-socialized leftist is consumed by feelings of weakness and inadequacy. They cope by seeking moral superiority, not through achievement or strength, but through grievance. By framing themselves as defenders of the oppressed, they can invert their own personal failures into political righteousness. Notice Heather's structure. She begins by invoking distant suffering, migrants, refugees, positioning herself as their advocate. She then pivots to demonizing her political opponents, accusing them of sadism and tribalism. Finally, she claims to speak for universal values like empathy and justice. This is not universal morality, it's ego defense. Heather's compassion exists only so long as it serves to elevate herself above others. The irony is stark. While accusing others of tribalism, she engages in the exact same behaviour, only cloaked in progressive language. Over-socialized individuals repress natural impulses so thoroughly that these impulses resurface in distorted, destructive ways. Heather's text is an example of this projection. She rails against cruelty while displaying it. She accuses her opponents of dehumanizing others, yet she herself dehumanizes them, portraying millions of people as cartoon villains motivated purely by malice. Empathy and sanctity of life, she sneers, are not universal values but tribal shields. This is not analysis, it's confession. Heather sees bad faith everywhere because she cannot conceive of good faith outside her own political tribe. Her contempt for opponents is not reasoned critique, It is her own repressed hostility projected outward. Heather's description of gun rights is especially revealing. She writes of firearms as if they are objects of worship, civic sacraments, in a grotesque religion. This framing exposes her psychological fragility. Oversocialized individuals must constantly invent enemies to sustain their sense of moral purpose. In a world where technology has rendered most genuine struggles meaningless, they turn to symbolic crusades. The gun owner is not merely someone with a different view, he is a heretic, a blasphemer, against the secular creed of progress. By inflating this conflict into a cosmic battle, Heather validates her own identity as a warrior for justice. Without this enemy, her worldview collapses. Thus, she must exaggerate, caricature, and demonize because the stakes of her narrative are existential. Without perpetual crisis, she has no self. Heather condemns selective outrage while practicing it at every turn. She grieves loudly when those within her ideological circle suffer but dismisses or even celebrates the suffering of others. This isn't a contradiction in her mind because, for the oversocialized, moral consistency is irrelevant. What matters is maintaining alignment with the dominant ideological consensus of her tribe. To mourn an outsider equally would threaten her standing within that tribe. Better to compartmentalize, to ration compassion, to twist reality itself than to face the terrifying possibility that suffering is universal and her narrative is false. This is why her rhetoric feels so hollow. It isn't aimed at understanding the world, it's aimed at preserving her own fragile identity. Heather believes she is defending empathy and humanity. In truth, she is defending her place in a collapsing order. Modern industrial society strips individuals of autonomy and meaning. The oversocialized cling to ideology as a lifeline, mistaking obedience for morality. They become the most zealous enforcers of the very system that dehumanizes them. Heather's essay is a cry for order. Her attacks on her political opponents are not just about justice. They are about stabilizing her own inner chaos by externalizing it onto a scapegoat. If the right-wing other did not exist, she would have to confront the emptiness of her own beliefs. Heather sets out to expose hypocrisy, but her essay is a mirror she cannot bear to look into. She condemns selective outrage while embodying it. She decries tribalism while practicing it. She accuses others of cruelty while wielding cruelty as a weapon. Her entire worldview is a survival mechanism for a psyche at war with itself. The oversocialized cannot create or transcend, they can only destroy, because destruction is the only proof of their moral existence. Heather's text is not a critique of injustice, it is a symptom of the very sickness she claims to oppose. Like all symptoms, it will persist until the root cause, the spiritual and psychological emptiness of modern ideological man, is faced without illusion. Until then, Heather will continue to rage against shadows, blind to the fact that the monster she despises most is the one staring back at her from the glass.